Bayshore is a city that never sleeps, but the Evans family mansion on Palm Island always slept well. It had thick walls, cold air conditioning, and enough money inside it to make sure nothing ever disturbed the peace. That peace ended on a Sunday evening in March, when Mr. Anthony Evans, the 50-year-old owner of Evans Maritime and Logistics, walked into his mother's sitting room and made an announcement that shook the whole family like an earthquake in a place that had never had one before. "I got married yesterday," he said. Just like that. No warning. No drum roll. He said it the way another man might say he had changed his phone number. The room went silent. Even the ceiling fan seemed to slow down out of respect for the shock in the air. His mother, Lady Margaret Evans, was the first to speak, and her voice came out thin, like a wire about to snap. "Married who, Anthony? To who did you marry?" "Her name is Claire," he said. "Claire Bennett." Nobody in that room had ever heard the name before. Not his mother. Not his younger sister, Patricia, who was sitting on the leather couch with a glass of wine that suddenly felt too heavy to hold. Not his business partner and cousin, Liam, who had come for Sunday dinner expecting pot roast and small talk. Not a wedding announcement. "Where did you meet her?" Patricia asked, and there was already suspicion sitting on her tongue like pepper. "At a hospital," Anthony said. "She was a nurse. She took care of me after the accident last year. We fell in love. It's that simple." It did not sound simple to anybody else in that room. In fact, it sounded like the opening of every story they had ever heard about a poor woman who finds a sick rich man, nurses him back to health, and then nurses her way into his bank account. Bayshore society was full of such stories, some true, most exaggerated, but all of them were now running through Lady Margaret's mind like a horror film on repeat. "A nurse," Lady Margaret repeated slowly, as if tasting a bitter fruit. "My son, a billionaire, married a common nurse. Overnight, without telling his own mother." "She's not common," Anthony said gently, but firmly. "You'll see." Nobody believed him. Not one person in that room believed him. And that is where our story truly begins. The Evans family, being a family that solved every problem with either money or manipulation, decided to test the new wife. Patricia organized what she called a welcome dinner, but it was really an ambush dressed up in expensive tablecloths. She invited 15 guests, society women who knew how to smile with their mouths while their eyes did all the real talking. Business associates who liked to gossip in French so the uneducated people at the table wouldn't understand them. And, for good measure, Patricia invited her old friend Bianca, a woman known across Bayshore high society for asking uncomfortable questions in the sweetest voice possible. Dinner began politely enough. Then Bianca, right after the wine was poured, turned to Claire with a smile so sugary it could give a person diabetes and asked, "So, Claire, dear, tell us. What was your family background before Anthony rescued you?" The word rescued hung in the air like smoke. Claire did not flinch. She wiped her mouth gently with her napkin and said, "My family was simple. My father was a teacher. My mother sold provisions in a small shop. I grew up in Green Hill. I worked very hard to become a nurse because I wanted to help people. That's really all there is to know." It was a humble answer, and it should have ended the conversation. But Bianca was not finished. "It's just interesting," she continued, tilting her head like a curious bird, "how a nurse's salary managed to buy that Chanel bag you're carrying tonight." The table went quiet. Even the waiters, who had been trained their whole careers to be invisible, seemed to lean in slightly. Claire looked down at the small black bag beside her, and for the first time that evening, something flickered across her face. Not embarrassment, not fear, something closer to amusement. "This bag," she said calmly, "was a gift from my husband. He bought it for me the week we got engaged, because he said I deserved nice things after years of buying nothing for myself. If that offends anyone at this table, I am sorry, but I did not marry Anthony to apologize for being loved." There was a pause. Then, surprisingly, Liam let out a short laugh and raised his wine glass slightly, as if silently applauding. Patricia's jaw tightened. Lady Margaret said nothing, but her eyes narrowed the way they always did when she was recalculating her opinion of somebody. Bianca smiled thinly and changed the subject to real estate prices, which, in Bayshore, is always a safe topic because everybody has an opinion and nobody actually agrees. Patricia did not give up easily. If dinner ambushes did not work, she would try something more direct. She hired a private investigator, a wiry, sharp-eyed man named Mr. Douglas who specialized in what he liked to call background clarity for wealthy families who wanted to know exactly who their money was marrying. "Find everything," Patricia told him, sliding an envelope of cash across the table of a quiet cafe in Harbor District. "Where she really comes from. Who she really is. I don't care how deep you have to dig." Mr. Douglas took the job, mostly because the money was good and partly because he genuinely liked a challenge. He started in Green Hill, where Claire said she was from. He found the small house where she grew up, confirmed her father had indeed been a schoolteacher, quiet, respected, and now retired. He found her nursing school records, spotless, top of her class, several commendations for handling difficult emergency cases with unusual calm. Everything checked out. Boring, honest, ordinary. Mr. Douglas almost gave up and told Patricia there was nothing to find. Almost. Because there was one detail that kept nagging at him. A 3-year gap. Between the time Claire finished her nursing certification and the time she started working at the hospital where she met Anthony, there were 3 years completely missing from her official records. No job history. No known address. It was as if she had simply disappeared and then reappeared, 3 years later, older, sharper, and with a very different way of carrying herself. When Mr. Douglas reported this gap to Patricia, her eyes lit up like Christmas morning. "There it is," she said, smiling for the first time in weeks. "That's where the real story is hiding." She was right. She just had no idea what kind of story it actually was. Here is what nobody in the Evans family knew, and what this narrator will now happily tell you, because a story like this deserves to be told properly. Claire Bennett had not simply vanished into thin air during those 3 years. She had gone to Ashford. Her younger brother, Ethan, had been born with a heart condition so severe that hospitals, however good their doctors were, simply did not have the specialized equipment needed to save him. Claire, then only 23 years old, had made a decision that most young women her age would never dare to make. She left her nursing job, took every bit of savings her family had, and traveled to Ashford to work as a live-in caregiver for an elderly woman named Mrs. Eleanor Whitfield, a retired surgeon's widow who happened to be one of the richest women in Maple District. It was not glamorous work. Claire bathed Mrs. Whitfield, cooked for her, managed her medications, and sat with her through long, lonely nights when the old woman's memory would slip and she would forget which decade she was living in. But Claire was patient, and more than that, she was brilliant. She began quietly managing Mrs. Whitfield's household finances, spotting errors that the old woman's accountant had been making for years, sometimes on purpose. She saved the household nearly £200,000 in the first year alone simply by paying attention. Those 2 years were not easy ones. Mrs. Whitfield could be a difficult woman on her bad days, sharp-tongued and stubborn, the kind of patient who threw insults the way other people threw compliments. There were nights Claire sat on the cold kitchen floor of that big Ashford house, crying quietly into a dish towel, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake leaving everything familiar behind. But she never once considered going home early, because every time she thought of quitting, she thought of Ethan's small chest rising and falling too fast, and that thought was always stronger than her tiredness. Slowly, something shifted between the two women. Mrs. Whitfield began to look forward to Claire's morning tea more than her medication. She began telling stories about her late husband, the surgeon, and about a daughter who had moved abroad decades earlier and rarely called. She began, in her own stiff, old-fashioned way, to treat Claire less like hired help and more like the granddaughter she never had. Claire, for her part, never asked for anything beyond her wages, never hinted at wanting more, and that, more than anything, is probably why more eventually came to her. Mrs. Whitfield, who had no children of her own living nearby and had grown genuinely fond of the sharp, kind young woman who cared for her, made a decision before she passed away peacefully in her sleep 2 years later. She left Claire a sum of money in her will, not enough to be called a fortune by Ashford standards, but more than enough, when converted and sent home, to fund Ethan's heart surgery 3 times over, with plenty left to spare. Claire used that money exactly as she planned. Ethan got his surgery in a private hospital in Rivermead. He survived. He thrived. Today he was a healthy 19-year-old studying engineering, and Claire had never once mentioned this story to anyone at the Evans house, because she had learned a long time ago that rich people rarely believe poor people can be resourceful. They prefer to believe poor people got lucky, or worse, got cunning. She came home from Ashford with money in the bank, wisdom in her head, and absolutely no interest in ever depending on anyone else's fortune again. She went back to nursing not because she had to, but because she loved it, and because sitting idle had never suited her. That was where she met Anthony, hurt and terrified after a car accident, and she had simply done her job the way she always did, with skill, with calm, and with the kind of steady kindness that makes frightened people feel safe. Ethan, now a healthy young man studying engineering, had actually met Anthony once before the wedding, though the Evans family never knew this either. He had come to the hospital one evening to bring his sister dinner, and had ended up sitting for nearly an hour beside Anthony's bed, the two of them talking about football while Claire finished her rounds. Anthony liked him instantly, liked his easy laugh and his habit of arguing passionately about which team deserved to win the league that season. When Ethan finally shook his hand goodbye, he had said, half joking, half serious, "Take care of my sister. She gave up everything for me once. Somebody should give something back to her for a change." Anthony had not forgotten those words. If anything, they were part of the reason he proposed as quickly as he did, without asking his mother's permission, without consulting a single lawyer about prenuptial agreements, without doing any of the cautious, calculated things a man in his position was supposed to do before marrying. He simply knew, the way people sometimes simply know things, that Claire was worth the risk. Anthony had fallen in love with her long before he ever knew about her small hidden fortune, and honestly, by the time he found out, it barely mattered to him. He had more money than 100 families could spend in 100 years. What he did not have, and what he desperately needed, was a woman who did not want anything from him except his honesty and his time. Mr. Douglas, the private investigator, eventually found pieces of this story too, though not all of it, because Claire had been careful, and Mrs. Whitfield's estate lawyers were even more careful. He reported to Patricia that the missing years appeared to involve caregiving work in Ashford and possibly a small inheritance. Nothing scandalous, nothing that suggested gold digging or trickery. Patricia was furious, not because the truth was bad, but because the truth was good, and good truths do not make satisfying gossip. While Patricia was busy chasing shadows, a much bigger threat was quietly forming around Evans Maritime and Logistics, and it had nothing to do with Claire at all. A rival shipping conglomerate, run by a cold, calculating businessman named Marcus Reed, had been trying to swallow up smaller shipping companies across the region for years. Evans Maritime was his biggest remaining target, and he had finally found a weakness to exploit: a corrupt junior accountant inside Anthony's own company who had been quietly feeding financial information to Reed's people for almost a year. The plan was simple and cruel. Reed's team would use the leaked information to manufacture a financial scandal, timed perfectly to crash Evans Maritime's stock price right before a major shareholder vote. Once the stock dropped low enough, Reed could swoop in and buy controlling shares for pennies on the dollar. It was corporate warfare, the kind fought not with guns but with spreadsheets, and it was every bit as ruthless. Anthony, distracted by wedding planning and family drama, did not notice the warning signs. His trusted finance director did not notice either, mostly because the finance director was, unfortunately, not nearly as sharp as he liked to believe himself to be. Claire noticed. She had not spent 2 years secretly managing a wealthy widow's finances in Ashford for nothing. One evening, while waiting for Anthony to finish a late meeting, she found herself glancing over a stack of company reports left carelessly on his desk. Something in the numbers felt wrong to her, the way a nurse can sense something is wrong with a patient before the machines even beep. Certain transfers were happening at strange hours. Certain figures had been quietly adjusted, just enough to avoid raising immediate alarm, but not quite enough to escape a truly careful eye. She said nothing that night. She simply began watching more closely. Over the next 2 weeks, Claire did something nobody in the family expected from a simple nurse. She quietly requested access to the company's financial archive, using her position as Anthony's wife to ask polite, harmless-sounding questions. She spoke to junior staff members with the same warm patience she used to speak to frightened hospital patients, and people, feeling comfortable around her, told her things they might never have told an official investigator. She discovered the identity of the leaking accountant within 10 days. His name was Felix, a quiet young man with expensive taste and gambling debts that had clearly outpaced his modest salary a long time ago. She discovered the pattern of the leaks. She discovered, most importantly, the date of the planned scandal, timed exactly 9 days before the shareholder vote. When she finally brought everything to Anthony, spreading printed documents across his office desk like a detective solving a case in a movie, he stared at her for a long moment before speaking. "How?" he asked slowly. "Does a nurse know how to read a forensic audit trail?" Claire smiled, that same small, careful smile she had worn on her very first day in the Evans mansion, except this time there was steel behind it. "I spent 2 years managing a very rich woman's finances in Ashford," she said. "I learned to read numbers the way I learned to read hearts on a monitor. Numbers don't lie, Anthony. People do. But numbers always tell the truth if you know how to listen." Anthony, to his credit, did not waste time being shocked. He trusted her completely, brought in his company's real security team, and together with Claire's evidence, they quietly built a case against Felix and, through him, against Reed's scheme. The confrontation happened at, of all places, another family dinner, 3 weeks before the shareholder vote. Patricia, still convinced she would eventually expose Claire as a fraud, had invited Mr. Douglas to present his findings formally to the whole family, hoping to embarrass the new wife once and for all. Mr. Douglas, to his credit, was an honest man even when the money paying him wanted otherwise. He stood in front of the family and calmly explained that Claire's background, while unusual, was completely legitimate. There was no scandal. There was no trickery. Just a hard-working woman who had made sacrifices for her family and built a quiet life through patience and intelligence. Patricia's face fell, but she recovered quickly, ready to argue that this proved nothing about the woman's true intentions now. That was the exact moment Anthony stood up and told the entire family what Claire had discovered at the company. He explained the leaked information, the corrupted junior accountant, Reed's plan to crash the stock and steal the company through the back door. He explained, in front of everyone, that his wife, the nurse everyone had dismissed as a gold digger, had personally uncovered a plot that could have cost the family billions of dollars and possibly the entire company. The room fell into the kind of silence that feels heavier than noise. Lady Margaret was the first to break it. She looked at Claire for a long moment, studying her the way a woman studies something she has misjudged badly. "Why?" she finally asked, her voice softer than anyone had heard it in weeks. "Did you never tell us any of this?" Claire shrugged gently. "Because nobody asked," she said. "Everyone in this house was so busy assuming things about me that nobody ever simply asked who I really was." It was not said with anger. It was said with the calm honesty of someone who had long ago made peace with being underestimated, and who had learned that being underestimated was sometimes its own quiet advantage. Patricia, for the first time since Anthony's announcement months earlier, said nothing at all. There was, for once, nothing clever left for her to say. With the truth now fully known and the family finally united instead of divided, the Evans team moved quickly. Felix, the leaking accountant, was confronted with the evidence and, faced with the choice between quiet resignation or criminal prosecution, chose to cooperate fully, providing recorded conversations that directly implicated Reed's company in corporate espionage. Anthony took this evidence not to the courts first, but to the shareholders themselves, 3 days before the scheduled vote. He stood in front of the boardroom, Claire seated quietly beside him, and laid out exactly what had almost happened. It was, by every account from the people who were in that room, a tense meeting. Some of the older shareholders, men who had been investing in Evans Maritime since it was little more than 2 rusty ships and a stubborn dream, folded their arms and demanded to know how such a leak had gone unnoticed for so long. A few even muttered that perhaps the company's leadership was not as sharp as it used to be, and one particularly blunt old man asked, loudly enough for the whole room to hear, whether Anthony had been too busy with his new marriage to notice thieves working right under his nose. It was Claire who answered that question, calmly rising to her feet before Anthony could even open his mouth to defend himself. She walked the shareholders through the entire timeline, slide by slide, number by number, in the same patient, steady voice she once used to explain medication schedules to frightened patients. She showed them exactly when the leaks began, exactly how they were discovered, and exactly what had been done to stop them within days of being found. By the time she finished, the mood in the room had shifted from suspicion to something closer to quiet respect. The same old man who had questioned Anthony's focus leaned over to his neighbor and was overheard saying, "That woman should be running half the companies in this city." Nobody in the room disagreed with him. The very scandal Reed had planned to use against them became, instead, the very thing that exposed him. The stock, instead of crashing, actually rose, as investors were reassured by the transparency and the sharp handling of the crisis. Reed's company faced a formal investigation. His attempted takeover collapsed entirely, and in the strange, small world of Bayshore high society, his name became, for a while at least, a quiet joke among the very people he had once intimidated. Evans Maritime and Logistics did not just survive. It came out stronger, its board more impressed than ever with Anthony's leadership. And, though it was rarely said aloud in official meetings, more than a few board members privately joked that perhaps they should consider giving Mrs. Evans an actual seat at the table. Which, eventually, they did. 6 months after that dinner where Anthony first shocked his family, Claire was formally announced as a special advisor to the board, focusing on financial oversight and risk management. It was, everyone agreed, the strangest and most fitting job title anyone in the family had ever heard, given how it all began. Patricia, to everyone's surprise, was the one who eventually softened the most. Perhaps it was guilt over the private investigator. Perhaps it was simply the slow realization that a woman who could outsmart a corporate raider was probably not the type to waste her time scheming over inheritance money. Whatever the reason, the two women eventually developed something that, while not quite close friendship, was at least honest mutual respect, which in a family like the Balligans was practically a miracle on its own. Lady Margaret, in her own way, made peace too. She started introducing Claire at events not as Anthony's wife, but as the woman who saved our company, which, though slightly dramatic, was not exactly wrong. As for Bianca, the woman who had asked about the handbag that first dinner, she reportedly still tells the story at parties, though these days she tells it very differently. In her retelling, she was always secretly impressed by Claire from the very beginning, and had only asked that question to test her, out of loyalty to the family, of course. Memory, as it turns out, is a generous editor when reputations are on the line. Mr. Douglas, the private investigator, ended up with an unexpected reward for his honesty. Impressed by how thoroughly and fairly he had done his job, even when the truth did not favor the person paying him, Anthony hired him permanently as head of internal security for Evans Maritime. Mr. Douglas liked to joke, whenever the story came up at company gatherings, that he was the only man in the city who got promoted for failing to dig up a scandal. Patricia, to her credit, never once complained about the money spent hiring him. She had, after all, gotten her answer, even if it was not the answer she had been hoping for. Ethan visited often after the wedding, and he and Anthony eventually became close enough that Anthony began inviting him to sit in on certain low-stakes business meetings, half to teach him, half simply because he enjoyed the young man's company. Some of the staff joked that the household now had 2 Bennett family members quietly running circles around the Evans men, and nobody, not even the Evans men themselves, seemed to mind very much. If you had asked anyone at that first dinner what kind of woman marries a billionaire out of nowhere, they would have given you 100 confident guesses, and every single one of them would have been wrong. Nobody guessed nurse who saved a dying old woman's finances in Ashford. Nobody guessed sister who sold everything to save her brother's heart. Nobody guessed the quiet woman with the careful smile would end up being the sharpest mind in the entire boardroom. That, perhaps, is the real lesson buried inside this story, if a story like this needs a lesson at all. People rarely are who we assume them to be, especially the quiet ones, especially the ones who smile small and speak softly and never once bother to defend themselves against gossip they know is unfair. The loudest assumptions in any room are usually made by the people who have taken the least time to actually look closely. Claire never once raised her voice to prove herself to the Evans family. She simply kept being herself, patient, sharp, and quietly capable, until the truth became impossible to ignore. And in the end, that turned out to be a far more powerful weapon than any dramatic confrontation could ever have been. As for Anthony, whenever anyone asked him now why he married a nurse he had known for less than a year, he would simply smile and say the same thing every time. "I didn't marry a nurse. I married the smartest person I have ever met, who just happened to also be a nurse. And somewhere in the Evans mansion, in a sitting room that once buzzed with suspicion and gossip, Claire would usually just laugh softly at that line, shake her head, and go back to reading whatever financial report happened to be sitting nearby, because old habits, especially good ones, are very hard to break. Sometimes, late in the evening, when the house was finally quiet and the staff had gone home for the night, Anthony would find her still sitting under the reading lamp in the study, glasses pushed up on her nose, humming softly to herself while she worked through some report nobody had even asked her to look at. He would stand in the doorway for a moment, just watching, thinking about how close he had come to never meeting her at all, how one accident on one ordinary evening had somehow changed the entire direction of his life. He never told her this out loud, not because he was shy about it, but because some feelings are better kept as quiet gratitude than spoken words, and he suspected she already knew anyway. It was, in the end, the simplest and truest ending anyone in that family could have written for themselves, far simpler than any of the wild guesses whispered at that first dinner, and far better than anything gossip could have ever invented. The Evans family learned, slowly and a little painfully, that the most dangerous mistake wealthy people can make is assuming that money is the only kind of value a person can bring into a room. Claire brought something far rarer than money into that house. She brought good judgment, quiet resilience, and the kind of honesty that money, no matter how much of it exists, has never once been able to buy.